My name's Jason Swanson. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I am beaming in live and direct from Southwest Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh to be precise, where it is a scorching 93 degrees. And I hope that wherever you're joining us from, that the weather is perhaps a little bit kinder to you. This webinar and this conversation is brought to you by KnowledgeWorks. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to creating the future of learning together. To achieve that vision, we really look at multiple levels of transformation, ranging from the implementation of personalized learning to policy, advocacy, and research, and the study of the future, which is what brings us together for this conversation today. So the topic of this conversation is what's next for education. So this is a publication that we released several months ago that is really a summation of several publications for which we've released over the past 3-ish years. My name's Jason Swanson. I have the privilege of serving on KnowledgeWorks strategic foresight team. I help to lead that work. And really what that entails is thinking about change, making assumptions about where that change is headed, and thinking broadly and deeply about future possibilities for education. So we do this work to help colleagues and partners clarify vision, help them to unlock their thinking about broad possibility, but we really do it to ask better questions about the future. And I'm privileged today to be joined by 3 friends, colleagues, and thought partners. So we're joined by Charlie Brown, Senior Director for Systems Transformation at KnowledgeWorks, Sunanna Chand, Executive Director at the Reinvention Lab for Teach for America, and Dr. Jeff Hadley, Superintendent at Avonworth School District. And I'm super excited to be in conversation and community with these 3 folks. Because what I'm really hoping for during this conversation is to use our forecast content to frame some possibilities for what's going on and to get each one of their perspectives about how those changes are playing out really in areas that they work. So ranging from schools to the system at large to really thinking about innovative practices. The goal of the conversation today is to get several different perspectives around change and what could happen in the future. So as I mentioned, this publication really draws across several other publications that we've produced at KnowledgeWorks. You can see a smattering of them on my screen. But the way that our foresight practice typically works is we work in 3-year increments. The beginning of one of those 3-year arcs, we typically publish a comprehensive or a landscape analysis of what's going on. So we call it a comprehensive forecast. And in August, we'll be pleased to release our 7th forecast, Forecast 7.0. So in those remaining years, we'll take deeper dives into issue areas that were either raised in that forecast or we'll start to really press on strategies around what those forecasts have raised. So it's basically like, hey, you wrote the forecast, now what do I do with it, right? So this publication that we're focusing on today, What's Ahead in Education, really took that body of work and we sat down with it and said, if we were to look across all 3 years, what are the major trajectories of change? And where were we thinking, like, what were the hot spots in that forecast? So where were those domains? So as you can see here, we pulled from several different forecasts, ranging from our last anchor forecast all the way out to a forthcoming futures of assessment piece that we did in partnership with Assessment for Good. And we sat down and really began to ask ourselves, if we look back on this body of work, what were the major trajectories of change? And what were sort of the salient domains of learning that we explored that we would want to elevate and revisit? So those included broad future possibilities that looked at curricula and classroom practices, essentially asking questions around what's taught in learning environments and how it might be taught. assessment and credentialing, how learning is measured and validated, staffing and supports, so what roles and structures support learners and educators, technology and learning, so how technology is employed and used across education systems, and governance and decision making. So what approaches inform priorities for education? So as we sat back and looked at those big domains, we could kind of chart several broad factors of change, right? So trend over time, we were really looking for words such as increase or decrease, or plans and intentions or other patterns of change. And what came to the fore for us when it came to classroom, curricula and classroom practices included the increasing desire for relevant learning, which was leading to curricular adaptations to meet the demands of the 21st century while preparing students for active citizenship and to be change makers. We saw increasing interest in and adoption of community-centric education models, which was promoting socially oriented learning experiences and fostering strong connections between schools and surrounding communities. And we saw shifts towards flexible, culturally responsive education, which were increasing opportunities for personalization, interdisciplinary learning experience, and diverse forms of teaching. On the assessment and credentialing side, we saw advances in technology, which are expanding how, when, and where assessment might happen, and frankly, just enabling new forms of credentialing. We saw diversifying approaches to education and debates about its purpose, which are expanding considerations of what might be assessed and how assessment systems might be designed. And lastly, we saw increasing frustration with current accountability systems as barriers to vibrant learning experiences. So we really saw this as being a bottlenecked approach to thinking about scaling and deepening personalized learning. On the staffing and supports domain, we saw a big increase in interest in providing learner supports that address factors beyond academics, which was leading people to connect peers as mentors in new ways. We saw new ways of organizing learning, such as learning ecosystems, which were activating new educator roles and surfacing new skills and competencies that are needed to serve learners. And we saw continuing struggles with educator recruitment and retention, which were broadening really the idea of who's considered an educator and leading people to considering uses of AI when access to human teachers might be scarce. On the technology and learning side of things, we saw the rapid pace of development and transformative technologies such as AI, which is engendering significant excitement and frankly unease about what values they'll reflect and what human behaviors they'll impact and enable. We saw increasing interest in pursuing learner-centered education that's equitable, engaging, and relevant, which is inviting new considerations in terms of new approaches to technology use in education. And finally, the ongoing development of AI and other smart technologies is enabling the automation of tasks in many settings. In our final domain, we saw trajectories of change in terms of broadening access to communication channels through digital technologies, which is increasing opportunities for community members to participate in educational governance and decision-making. We saw increased attention to agency for young people, which is forging new ways for them to engage in governance and decision-making processes in schools. And we saw increasing interest in and movement towards things like co-design, which is prioritizing the involvement of a diverse array of constituents as partners in problem solving and innovating in public education. So I'm going to pause there. And if that was sort of setting up the context of things, I want to turn to my esteemed panelists here. And Sunanna, I'd like to start with you. So can you tell us a little bit about the charge for the Reinvention Lab at Teach for America and your role there?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Jason. It is wonderful to be here. I'm coming at everyone live from Oakland, California, so very nice to see you. And I'm already loving all of the beautiful conversation and connections happening in the chat right now. I think Lisa and Brian, y'all are besties, and it's nice to also be on this panelist with some old friends as well. So. My name is Sunanna. I'm honored to serve as the executive director of Teach for America's Reinvention Lab. You may have heard of Teach for America. You may not have heard of the Reinvention Lab. We are Teach for America's relatively new R&D, future learning R&D engine. And what that means is that we're obsessed with two problems. One problem is that, the education system was built 150 years ago for a very different economy, society, and technological landscape. And so how do we really build an education system that works for today's young folks and tomorrow's young folks? I have a 2-year-old, so this is becoming an ever more a personal issue for me as well as a professional passion. And the second problem that we're really trying to solve is, or at least make traction against, is about what Teach for America is always thinking about, which is high quality educational talent. How do we make sure that the highest quality educational talent and leadership is with each and every young person that needs it the very most? And so we are trying to bring new, leaders and educators into the field and make sure that that folks are being served in the very best ways. And so we really work at the intersection of those two problems and do very, very early stage research, design, and then the development of offerings that are at that intersection. So thank you for having me, Jason.
Oh, thank you for being here. And so, Sunanna, you and I have had the pleasure and privilege to be really thinking about the future of learning together since like 2016.
That's right.
And most recently, we co-published a forecast for the Reinvention Lab called "Dreaming into Learning Future." So you'll see a lot of those salient trends and ideas kind of woven through what's looking ahead at what's next for education. So, I got to know a little bit about Reinvention Lab and the work that you all do during the course of that collaboration. But when we start to think about that forecast and prior forecasts, KnowledgeWorks has really been exploring future possibilities for educator roles. So can you tell
Mhm.
us a little bit about the innovative efforts that the lab has really undertaken around thinking through staffing, supports, and educator roles?
I mean, first of all, I know Jeff and Jason through something called Remake Learning, which is an incredible network in Pittsburgh that is about 600 organizations, school districts, museums, libraries, out of school organizations, government, philanthropy, industry, who are all kind of coming together to think about the future of learning in the Pittsburgh region. So shout out remakelearning.org to learn more. Um, and what I learned being executive director of Remake Learning, and really immersing myself in the Pittsburgh community, is that I actually really started shifting my language from teacher to educator. I was like, there's so many educators that impact a young person's life. And most of a young person's waking hours over the course of the year are actually spent out of school. And so, what does it mean to have a learner and have that learner be in this like really you called it a learning ecosystem, but this idea that a learner goes from school to out of school to online to their faith community to other places and is learning in that entire moment and has educators kind of in that entire moment with them. And so I brought that experience into the Reinvention Lab where we started to do some early research. This was 2022, 2023 about what we called abundant staffing. And what we meant by that was how do we think about not putting ever more stuff on educators' plates. As a former educator, it was like I had to do everything in my classroom. And the more now you're a mental health specialist, and now you're also an AI specialist, and now you're doing all these other things. And how would it be possible to actually create an opportunity where there was an abundant amount of educators around a young person and actually around a teacher supporting them in their work? And what does that look like to have a really high quality educator and have a lot of other high quality talent around them? Because we know that our communities are filled with incredible educators, of all stripes. And so we started doing this research, and I just want to also shout out folks who are thinking about abundant staffing in lots of different ways. So like ASU's Next Educator Workforce is one, opportunity culture is another. There are a few folks who are out here trying to think about how do we arrange the human capital of a school system that really allows for a a lot of people to be impacting a learner's educational journey. And so we're looking into not only can we think about new educator roles in schools, but are new educator roles in schools a lever for the future of learning? Like, depending on the types of roles that you introduce, could those roles actually be uh, shepherding us towards like new learning outcomes? And we know that in the age of AI, I know some people were talking about AI and what they were interested in here. What we often talk about at the lab is like we have to use AI to build more human skills in young folks, because we have to make sure that young folks have the skills that AI can't do. And so we're like, can this abundant staffing model be a lever for the future of learning and for different outcomes for young people? And so that's kind of what we were exploring with that early research.
Oh, very cool. So the Reinvention Lab has great examples of both co-design and youth leadership. And that certainly was my experience in collaborating with all of you. So we share a few what ifs that really center the idea of youth as leaders in their education journey, and frankly, as change makers, in a publication that we put out called Envisioning Educator Roles for Transformation. Could you share an example of how the lab centers youth as experts? Because my experience was just absolutely terrific.
I mean, this is well, I will first say that we call it intergenerational co-creation. We used to call it youth adult co-creation. The change in that name actually came from young folks on our team. And I think the first thing I want to say is this is really hard. I always say I think more folks should do it because it has been transformational for my professional journey and for our work. And it's really hard work to really make sure that the power balances are right to actually center young people as in their expertise, and also have a balance. Not say that, young people are leaders and they're doing everything and the adults need to take a back seat, but also not saying that, the adults are the forefront leader and young people need to take a back seat and wait their turn. It's really co-creation. It's balancing generations, multi-generations together to make change. And what's been so transformational for us in that work is we really deeply believe that we cannot design for the future, designing for and not with. And so ever since literally the inception of the lab, we've had, it started with a youth fellowship that grew into more youth fellowships, that grew into young people actually seated on our teams, that grew into now we have, I have to shout out Izzy Fitzgerald, who's our lead of intergenerational co-creation. She's been on our team since she was 15. She's now 20, and just has seen kind of the evolution of intergenerational co-creation on our team and is really pushing us on the next edge of what that is. And co-creation looks many different ways. Sometimes it's having young people on our team. Sometimes it's just being in design sessions with young folks and asking their opinions about things all the time. So for instance, going back to the new educators work, we did a lot of work in deep communication with young people to be like, what are the roles that you would have wanted when you were in high school? Or if you're in high school now, like, what are the roles that you need right now that you're not seeing? If we even don't talk about roles, what are the things that you want? What do you want out of school and what's not serving you? And then we created a set of roles that we thought spoke to that. And then we went to young people again and we went to young people who are seniors in college and we said, okay, you don't want to be a teacher. These are actually folks who got accepted to the Teach for America Corps and declined it. We're like, okay, you don't want to be a teacher. Would you want to do any of these other roles that other fellow high school students helped us design? And there were things that are very similar to the publication that you recently released, Jason. Community belonging, well-being coordinator, facilitator of learning in the real world, makerspace facilitator, librarian of the future to work on AI and tech. And so we went back to young people and said, would you want to do any of these things? And they were like, nah. I mean, the overwhelming actually thing was like, there are larger questions for young people about the sustainability of the role in education in general. And
Mhm.
honestly, working with other young folks, that they were like, any of these roles would require me to probably take a financial hit. And I'm not confident and I don't feel like I have the experience to work with other young people. And I will say that there were a couple roles that really stood out: the belonging and wellness coordinator and the design your life facilitator that's like helping coach high school students into thinking about what their future could be, and kind of the multitudes of what that future could look like were very interesting to college students. But we design better when we design with young people. It's just a fact.
Absolutely. So last question. I know that this was not one that we had previewed, but given the audience interest around things like AI and knowing sort of the circles in which we both run and thinking through like our friend and colleague like Yusuf Ahmed, right? You talked about this ever so slightly from the staffing function, but what is the Reinvention Lab thinking, tinkering, doing, playing with in terms of the AI space in this moment?
Yeah. Well, shout out Yusuf. If you haven't played around with PlayLab AI, it's an incredible tool that was actually spun out of the Reinvention Lab when Yusuf was working on our team, and is just a really wonderful resource for educators. So hopefully we can drop that in the chat too. So we have something called Arcade AI, which is basically we're thinking about talent development for educators, and at very, very different levels, from the most kind of passive, I'm just kind of checking this out, engagement, to very, very deep engagements with educators. And our whole thing with Arcade AI is you got to play with it, you got to work with it, you got to tinker with it. And in doing that, kind of see how it's beneficial, not just for your work in the current system, but of course, with the Reinvention Lab, we're thinking about we like to say it's not just AI literacy, because AI literacy to us kind of conjures ideas of, you're able to understand how to type things into a chat bot and prompt correctly and get a good response, and maybe understand some of the ethical considerations around AI too, and that's a baseline. What we talk about is AI dexterity, which is you need to be able to wield this. You need to be able to build with it. You need to be able to construct with it, not just consume it. And that is, create with it, not just consume it. This is the foundation of how we think about this work, because ultimately we need to build very contextualized, individualized AI tools in our school systems that get us to the future of learning, not just build better lesson plans or better worksheets or test prep, but actually say, okay, now what do young people need to learn in the 21st and 22nd century? And how does AI actually fuel us to get us to that future? And so we work with literally thousands of educators. Every incoming core member is trained in how to build with this technology. We are working with alumni and folks across the country to think about how do we build this AI dexterity for educators? And again, this is right at the intersection of those two problems I mentioned earlier, of like obsessed with the problem of high quality educational talent and obsessed with the problem of like how do we build reinvent the education system. When those two things come together, that's the sweet spot for us.
Love it. Thank you. All right, so next on my list here, Dr. Jeff Hadley. So Jeff, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the Avonworth School District. Oh, you're muted.
Remember earlier I said I was going to stay unmuted? That's why. Anyway, thanks for having me, Jason. It's an honor to join this panel and talk a little bit about the future of education with everybody. So a little bit about Avonworth. I'm also here in the steamy, hot Pittsburgh area, like Jason is. It's very hot at the moment. We are about 10 minutes north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a smaller school district in size in this area, about 2,000 students. A couple things I think are really important to note about Avonworth is it's been present for a while, but we have this innovative spirit in our school district from my predecessor, Tom Ralston, and I hope I'm carrying that torch well in my superintendency now. We really think about trying to break boundaries, and something that I think we are always thinking about is we're always hungry for what's next. I don't like to be satisfied with the current status of anything. And I think in today's world, you better be hungry for what's next or you're going to get left behind. So a couple other things I want to mention about Avonworth were, like I said, we have this innovative spirit. We're part of the Digital Promise League of Innovative Schools. We have been since about 2015, so a good 10 years in the league, working with other superintendents and educators around the country, thinking about these questions. How do we change education? How do we keep moving forward? How do we break the barriers that we're all used to in education? Here in Pittsburgh, if you're not familiar with the Pittsburgh area, Sunanna mentioned this earlier with Remake Learning. We have this really unique ecosystem here in Pittsburgh. Remake Learning has now grown beyond Pittsburgh, but that's where it was born. And that in and of itself, I think, is one of the catalysts for this creative, innovative thinking in our region, which has also led to a lot of collaboration. Over the last few years, there's about 32 districts that have been part of the AASA Learning 2025 Alliance, but we created our own Western PA Alliance so we can do a little bit more work together and collaborate here. So there's a lot of powerful thinking happening in the region, which I'm very thankful for as a superintendent. I benefit from that because I dive into all of that and want to take part in all of it. And it's helped keep us moving in this direction of wanting to see change and provide our kids with what they need for the future. A couple things, Jason, you may mention this, but we're really cognizant right now about the future and what we need to change. I know I said this recently on a panel that I feel like for about 20 years, we've been making this comment that things are changing faster now than they ever will. Just, it's like times a million. I don't know how, I don't know if that's even a saying we're saying anymore, but we really do need to be thinking, especially in education. We have so many things that are entrenched in tradition and just what we're used to. One of the things that I think is challenging in education is everyone went through it, so everyone has an opinion, and that can hold us back at times. And I think as a leader, we have to be brave enough to face those traditions and talk about changing them and making change for the benefit of our students. One thing we did recently with KnowledgeWorks was put on this graduation 2035 party because of that need to think beyond just, it was to kick off our strategic planning process. And I didn't want us to be thinking about small changes. So we forced people to think about the future by calling it the graduation party 2035. So that's a little bit about Avonworth, kind of what we're focused on right now. We're really focused on what changes do we need to make, a lot focused on in high school, but even through the K-12 system. How do we keep changing to make sure kids are getting what they need to prepare them for the future?
Thanks, Jeff. So for context, Charlie and I and a few other colleagues had the privilege to partner with Jeff and the Avonworth School District. And we threw a graduation party in the year 2035 and invited basically everybody from the district to come to kick off a strategic planning process. So it was a way to really get folks into a headspace where the future maybe looks radically different, to incite some bolder ideas around vision and inform that strategic plan. So it was fantastic. It was the polar opposite of today. It was freezing out, and we had 100 some odd folks come, experience this future, and give us their ideas then for the vision that they would hold by sort of kicking the tires on what we would call an alternative future. And I want to pick up on that thread, right? So we know that you're undergoing a strategic planning process at this current time, right? So having been just a small part of that process with the party, there has been a ton of discussion about the use of school time and where learning happens. So we heard that a lot during the context of the party, and we saw that as being an important part of the community's aspiration. So one of the possibilities that KnowledgeWorks forecasts on the whole have explored is this idea of making sort of the school walls increasingly porous, which is just a really fancy way of saying, how do we invite the community into the school, and how do we put learners and weave their learning experience throughout the community itself? So can you share just a little bit about your own visions for the use of time in the school district, and maybe some of the learnings or the desires that came out of the graduation party around use of time?
Absolutely. I'll try to stay out of some weeds because my mind wants to go to some really detailed things I'd like to see change. But as far as the community goes, I think what I hear from students is that students want more experiences in school that will help them prepare for their future. And by that, they mean, like, how do they make connections with the content they're learning to how it might be used in the future? So although content will always be important, it's not as important, in my opinion, as the experience that students receive that content, or the experiences they have to build upon the content they're learning in the classroom, or learn how to apply that content. So what I want to see in the future, as you mentioned, this porous idea of us partnering with community organizations, businesses, partners, in any which way we can find them, to be here in the school, partnering with us to help even design curriculum or be part of courses, part of curriculum, part of learning. But then also students need to be able to take the opportunity to go outside of our walls to experience things in the world. One thing that I never want a student to leave us after their senior year kind of unsure what their next step is. I want students to leave us, they may not have it all figured out. Sometimes I'm 52, I'm not sure I have it all figured out, but I want them to have an idea of what they are interested in, where their passions are, what their feel confidence in what they can take out into the world and do, so that they have a path. And that can't happen once they get to hand the diploma and they go off and try to figure it all out that summer. They have to have experiences through their K-12 education that will help them be able to make that decision more wisely as they get to the end of the high school pathway. So one quick example might be, we've done this in the past, having a corporation partner with us to provide real life problems that they're facing in their businesses, and have our kids take a crack at solving those problems. They may not solve the problem, but the process they go through at trying to figure out how to solve the problem is where the value is. And then vice versa, going outside of our building and having experiences. Everyone wants to turn right to job shadow, internship. Those are important, obviously. So we need kids to be able to have those experiences too, outside of the school, but that can't be the only thing. So there's lots of different, like I said, I'll try to stay out of some of the weeds I want to get myself into at times, but we just need to give kids valuable experiences so they understand more about themselves, their talents, their passions, and how they can excel and apply that in the world.
Absolutely. And with the recent policy changes in Pennsylvania, so Act 56, what our friend Greg Bear might call the gift of 990 hours, teacher, more autonomy for teacher evaluations, more autonomy for developing pathways, the ability to sort of lean into that vision and make it real. I think it just gets easier every day, right? So the policy environment has flipped from, maybe a bottleneck or a wall to an enabling force for a lot of the aspects of the futures that you just described. So I think it's an exciting time for folks in Pennsylvania. So Jeff, I know from just having partnered with you and your learners that Avonworth School District, much like the Reinvention Lab, values student voice. So one of the provocations we've explored centers on the idea of inclusive decision-making bodies that involve local school leaders, parents, and students. Can you share a bit about the Youth Advisory Council at Avonworth School District?
Yeah. When I started as a superintendent, I think one of my biggest joys as an educator, my whole career, is teaching the kids. So when I became the superintendent, I really I wanted to focus on their voices and have them included in the decision-making process. So I created for us the Student Superintendent Advisory Board. And I was intentional in putting student first, because their voices are really what drives everything. So that is a group of students here at the high school. I have grades 9 through 12 that are represented. Next year, we plan to trickle down into middle school since they're on the same campus and available to us. I meet with them about once a month, sometimes more often if we're problem solving something. And I wrote down when Sunanna said, she just said, "What do you want?" Honestly, that's all you have to do is ask kids what they want. I find it a little strange at times that, in education, we make a lot of decisions around tables that just include adults, and you really have to have students at these tables. And today, more than ever, or maybe kids are just braver than I was when I was their age, but they are not shy about saying what they want and what they need. And it's not in a disrespectful manner. It's an honest, true observation of an awareness of what they feel they really need today. They're much more in tune with the world than I was at their age. They're much more in tune with their education and what they want to get out of it than I was. When I was in high school, I was just trying to check off all the classes I needed to take to get my diploma and move on to college. These kids don't want to just check boxes. They want to have a voice. They want to have a say. And what they have to say is really meaningful and it's impactful. So I took those students. We moved some of them I offered them the opportunity to be on our strategic planning committee. You interacted with a group of them through the grad party, and their insight is invaluable. And it's really made a difference here in how I think about changes we need to make. And their voices have definitely had an impact on the strategic planning process and some of the changes we plan to make as we move into the next 5 years with that plan.
Thanks, Jeff. And I can say just from anecdotal experience here that when asking your young people what they wanted for the future, one of the things that I was most impressed by was just the general want and desire to care for each other. And I just think that that's such an awesome message to carry away as an adult in that conversation. All right, so last but not certainly least, I'd like to welcome Julianna Charles Brown, or Charlie Brown. So Charlie, thanks for being here. Charlie's a colleague and friend of mine here at KnowledgeWorks, and you work for one of the coolest named teams ever. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about what the systems transformation team does.
Sure, sure. And thanks again so much for the opportunity to be on this panel with some folks who I really respect and have valued learning from. So here at KnowledgeWorks, we have a team called the Systems Transformation Team. And really, that's a very fancy way of saying we're working really hard to connect different levels of the education system to affect change together. Because what we know, or what we've learned, KnowledgeWorks is a national nonprofit. We've kind of been in the space of education change now for 20 plus years. Over the course of that time, we've learned a couple of really interesting things. Step one, if one level of the system gets ahead of the other, it's going to be problematic, right? So we've seen lots of different iterations of education change efforts. We've learned that if teachers or educators in the classroom or learners get too far ahead of where their system is, frustration, angst, we're not able to go as fast as we want. Dr. Hadley, to your point, we know what we want from our education, and the system is not designed for us. The policies are not oriented to allow us to get what we need. We've also seen the reverse pattern, right? Where we have system leaders that may be really interested in innovating. They go to a conference, they get excited about an idea, and they say, now our whole state is going to be a personalized learning state. Without doing the commensurate community engagement, co-design work that's really necessary to make that kind of change actually happen. So that's sort of one piece of it. And then the other piece of it that we've learned throughout this work is that because our education system is over 100 years old and is something that is, to a point that was shared earlier, something that is a universal experience. So most people, or the vast majority of people, have gone through a traditional education experience. And so what that means is we feel like that's what education is, right? The 57 minutes to the bell, or 47 minutes, depending on how traditional you are at this moment. The core disciplines that were established by the Committee of 10 in 1892. So that's our math, science, reading. And those systems are entrenched on such a deep level, it's almost like molecular. And those systems are really difficult to change, and that change will take time, right? And there's a lot of will around making that change. But what we often see is that if there isn't a commensurate commitment across all levels of the system to be in this change for the long term, that's where we start to see like fits and starts and momentum. And then you get into a conversation with educators and they're like, weren't we doing this in the 80s? And so the systems transformation team is really trying to think about what does it look like to create authentic momentum at each level of the system and sustain that momentum through educational transformation.
Amazing. So one of the possibilities we looked at in this forecast was actually pulled from a publication that you led called Beyond the Horizon. So a set of recommendations that came from essentially a huge national convening held in Denver a few years ago, focused on moving from our current systems of assessment and accountability towards learner-centered school quality systems. Mm-hmm. Part of those recommendations focused on the establishment of personalized assessment systems. So could you share a little bit about what such a system might look like, or even point us towards some examples?
Sure. So just to say a little bit, because I know both Dr. Hadley and Sunanna, you've shared amazing examples of co-creation. The Trailblazer Summit, which was the convening that Jason was just referring to, was an awesome experience where we actually had the opportunity to convene folks from all levels of the system, right? So we had educators, system leaders, nonprofit leaders, our national civil rights community, but importantly, facilitated and co-designed by young people. And so that was just a fabulous experience for those of us that had the opportunity to join. And so coming out of that, lots of great recommendations, and I'm sure we're going to be dropping the link to that publication in the chat. But specific to your question, Jason, is the concept of personalized assessment systems. And I want to pull on a couple of different threads that I've heard throughout the comments today. And I promise this is I'm going to get my way over to personalized assessment systems. But one of the things that we hear as a common concern when we think about change management towards a more personalized system, right, is we're talking about divergent paths, right? We're saying students are going to be on a personalized pathway that's driven by their passions. How do we manage that as system leaders? What does it actually look like at the classroom level? Am I now teaching 30 different students in 30 different ways at 30 different moments in time? Now you plus that out to a school, district, or system level. How do you actually work together as a system to affect that kind of change? And some of the things, I know Remake Learning is getting a lot of shout outs here today, and I'll give them one more because I think Remake Learning years ago was one of the initial groups that started talking about an ecosystem for education, right? And we're thinking more about our traditional systems function like a machine, like this happens, then that happens, and this happens, whereas an ecosystem or a forest functions in a much more organic, interconnected way. And there still have to be some things, common languages that make the system interact with each other. And at KnowledgeWorks, we've really arrived at the concept of personalized and competency-based learning as an important way to make sure that we have a connection or through line to all the learning that happens for young people. When we say competencies, what we're talking about is the set of high-value, transferable skills and critical understandings that are, of course, going to show up in every discipline, but also transcend discipline and learning experiences. And I say all that to say, when you start to reframe learning experiences around those skills and understandings, that's where you really start to get the opportunity to personalize. Because I know that maybe I'm really interested in a healthcare career, and I'm also weirdly interested in anime and drawing. And like those two things can be true about me. But if I know that I'm practicing critical thinking through both of those interests, I can get context and purpose for both of those experiences. And then I can also hook my learning into other learning experiences about topics which may not be super interesting to me, but I know that that's an opportunity for me to practice my critical thinking. So like I'll hang out in this Korean War project right now because critical thinking is important. I'm practicing my critical thinking. I say all that to say, I think that competencies really provide an interesting opportunity for us to have a core around which we are organizing learning and then assessment, which is actually what starts to make this really diverse and divergent and beautiful, messy in a good way type system possible, because we can come back to a shared set of what do we want learners to come out of our system with. And all across the country, we've been doing what we call portrait of a graduate or portrait of a learner or competency work. And it's like some version of like the same 10 skills, critical thinking, collaboration, you know. And so I say all that to say, when we think about a personalized assessment system, I think it's one which has a core of we've identified the most important things that we want you to take out of the learning of our system, and we've designed assessments to be flexibly assessing those things. So what I mean by that is we know we want you to be a critical thinker. We know we want you to be a problem solver. And therefore, this portfolio or this performance assessment is going to be your opportunity to demonstrate that learning to us when you feel that you're ready in a way that is meaningful to you. And so I think that's something that really starts to, when we have that core, make a lot of what could feel like a very disparate learning system, bring it back to a more centralized way to organize it. But that doesn't feel like it boxes anybody in.
That's helpful. That's a great frame. So thinking about that definition, are there any states or learning communities that you would point back to say they're doing the thing or they're on the road to what you've just described?
Yeah. And I think the answer to that question is many, and dependent on sort of where you're thinking about at the level of the system. So what we know now is that our federal policy systems are they dictate that federally required assessment happens in a very specific way. What we hear when we talk to learning communities across the country is that that drives us to fairly traditional assessments that may or may not be meaningful to the learning communities they serve. Within those federal policy systems, we do see states working to innovate within what is federally allowable. So there are 2 programs at the federal level that will allow states to test out new ideas for assessments. And so within those states, we had some early adopters. I actually did see some friends from New Hampshire on the webinar today. So the New Hampshire PACE program was an early iteration of a state that was trying to do a more performance or portfolio-based assessment. Their neighbors to the south in Massachusetts have a network of districts called the Mass Consortium for Innovation in Education Assessment that are really working to understand the value of teacher-created performance assessments and the value of creating and administering and scoring performance assessments to build up teachers' assessment capacity. And then we see folks who are starting to innovate in areas that are not federally required. And that's where you can really start to see some innovative assessment, like large-scale system designs. So there are states that are starting to explore what does it look like to have more performance or portfolio-based graduation requirements, right? So that's not something that's dictated by federal law, which means the assessments can be like a little bit more fluid, community contextualized to the learner. So our friends out in New Mexico are doing some really interesting stuff with their graduation requirements. And New York State has started the New York Plan pilot, where they're actually looking around at what are the performance assessment designs that may allow us to be more personalized either to the learner or to the community. And then I think the last organization or group that I would elevate are some friends located in New York City, the Internationals Network for Public School and the Consortium School. So they've actually got some of the longest standing programs of utilizing performance assessments for graduation requirements. And what they do in those contexts is they have shared rubrics where a student is producing a piece of evidence to say, I have mastered problem solving or critical thinking. And then those shared rubrics are scored with professional scorers. And I do see we also have some internationally joined folks. This is going to be similar to the International Baccalaureate system, where they're doing, shared rubrics, common scoring practices, and that's really where you start to see students can create their own unique and individualized projects, but you do get some of the inter-rater reliability using some of those shared scoring tools. Now I think I'm going too far into the weeds, Jeff.
Charlie, that's awesome. Thank you. So we've got about 10-ish minutes left, and I would regret, with just the brilliance of this panel, not opening this up to some audience Q&A. So if you have a question for Jeff, Charlie, or Sunanna, now is your time to ask. Sean, I might ask for some help going through some of the Q&A, but if you have a question for anybody on the panel, we'd love to hear it.
Jason, do you want me to talk to, I saw a question earlier that was to me. Do you want me to talk to that question?
Sure thing.
I'll just quickly, I think the question was, what has happened here at Avonworth maybe to start preparing students for the future as I was describing and giving them experiences. So I'll just highlight a few things. One thing we did this past year for K-2, instead of science being a class that all the K-2 teachers were working into their school day, we decided to experiment with making it kind of rotate through the special schedule, but not every 6 days or 5 days. It was in chunks of time where the students from a class would go to the science teacher. So we had one science teacher for the entire building, K-2. And what we noticed happened there, even at this young age of K-2, and I think it's important to talk, because a lot of times when we think about the future, people think we always talk about, well, just the high school side of it. But so I want to share this example to show something that can happen even at the younger grades. That teacher was so focused on the curriculum and the content learning, but had the autonomy to pull in whatever she wanted to pull in. So she started to partner with a lot of outside speakers coming into the classroom to talk about careers related to the content. So even at K-2, it was a unique approach to teaching science that started to give kids access to professionals in the world even at that young age. So it brought the content to life. That was one example. We do have a lot of project-based learning. We are moving toward senior portfolios, digital portfolios, where students are, focused on building that portfolio of experiences. We have a new AI and ethics and human flourishing course. So we're trying to give students experience there that are sort of unique to the K-12 space about, AI, the ethics around AI, but the human flourishing and just how do you flourish in today's world? So those experiences, a lot of our project-based learning, our teachers are fantastic at pulling in. I love when Sunanna said an abundant staffing community. I feel like that's what happens with our project-based learning. We pull in all these other people to be around the students and guide them through these projects. It's not just the teacher and the students. So they have experts around them, people like artists in residency who, participants in the learning process. So I feel like we offer an abundance of staffing in a different way through those projects. And one last thing I'll mention is we implemented a K-8 World of Work program where our students K-8 are exploring 6 careers every year, but connected to the content they're learning in the classroom. And they also take the RIASEC assessment in K-8 every single year. And they're very in tune with what their individual strengths are through the RIASEC assessment, Holland's Code, and start to learn their value in the world and possible careers they might be able to contribute to or have in the future. So those are a few examples of things we're doing here at Avonworth to hopefully change how our kids experience education and prepare them for the future.
I also want to speak to a couple questions that are also in the chat. Thanks, Jeff. One of them was elementary education, and I always like to shout out Redbridge Academy here in San Francisco, which does a lot of really incredible work. And I'm contractually obligated to say was founded by a TFA alum. Just kidding. The other thing I want to say is about AI, just very quickly. There's a really good question that was asked twice in the chat about how AI helps young people kind of step into their own learning paths. And I think we all have heard the conversations about AI tutors. I'm not going to talk about that. This summer, we run this is now our 3rd summer of running a program called Future Shock, which is about how to help young people in the summer. And these are folks who are, back doing credit gaining stuff in the summer, and help them think about their futures in a very nonlinear, ambiguous career landscape. So not saying like, you're interested in medicine, you will become a nurse, but actually thinking about what really are you interested in? How do we really develop those interests? And then create a project that speaks to a possible future for you, understanding that there are many futures. And it's a 2-week program, and we use AI for it's only required for like 2 hours, and then sometimes it gets in more, but it's hugely impactful for that specific moment in time. So in that like 2 hours, they've done the work with their human facilitator educators to think about their interests. Then they input those interests into an AI generator that we custom created that helps them develop a project idea that they can accomplish in this amount of time with the materials that they have. We also give them a small budget to purchase materials. And then and then the AI kind of coaches them on the first step. So it helps them think about how do we turn that interest into a rigorous project that is both linked to your academics and also linked to like things that you're really interested in, and a project that you can actually build to demonstrate this, going back to project demonstration, portfolios, et cetera. And the AI helps coach through what those first steps are to get started. And then the student can go back to that AI to help, okay, I'm stuck. Where do I go next? What's the next step? And it creates an opportunity for project-based learning educators to not just be running around like a chicken with their head cut off, like going to a bunch of different places and like trying to individually coach 24 young folks in a room, but allows AI to do that and start the process so that the educators can really facilitate the experience and coach along the way. Kind of like senior projects, Lisa, but certainly, we're doing it with as young as middle school this year, and helping young people start really early in those project-based experiences.
I kind of want to build on that and also answer a question that was very resiliently posted a bunch of times in the chat as the waterfall of comments came in, and the question is about really what is the role of culturally sustaining pedagogy in the future of education? And it's 2 things, and I'll endeavor to be brief. I think it's ever more important and ever more possible. So culturally sustaining pedagogy is like way more than we can get into in the 1 minute, but I think like a core tenet of it is that it is an assets-based orientation to a culturally diverse education landscape. And because that's true, I think that it really becomes important to help young people understand and navigate the future, which is uncertain as it relates to the world of work. But what is certain about the future is that young people are going to be entering the most diverse society that we have ever had in this country. So ever more important, ever more possible because of some of the technologies that Jeff and Sunanna have been talking about, and the way that we're using our more advanced technologies to provide more diverse learning experiences for young people, while also not to be the competency nerd in the crew, but being able to draw their cultural experiences and assets to a core of high value transferable skills, right? So we are still going to make sure that everybody has a rigorous education in the skills that matter most to us as a community, but we have much more dynamic ways of teaching, assessing, and honoring those things within our young people. So I feel personally hopeful and that we must commit to culturally sustaining pedagogy as we think about the future of education.
Awesome. So that is a wrap. We are at 2 o'clock. So I want to signal the slide you see here on the screen. We have an upcoming forecast that will be released at the end of the summer. It touches on things like, Brian, to your point, demographic cliffs, AI, climate change, everyday instabilities, and the reprovisioning of public goods and systems. So if you found this conversation valuable, we hope that you will check out the new forecast. Lastly, I want to thank my panel, Jeff, Sunanna, Charlie. Thank you all so much. For all of you that joined us today, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for the terrific questions. And yeah, have a terrific rest of your summer, and thanks for spending some time with us.